Have you ever stood at what was supposed to be the happiest moment of your life, only to realize you were standing at the edge of your own destruction? I have. And what I'm about to share with you isn't just my story. It's a warning, a testament to survival, and proof that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is say no when everyone expects you to say yes. My name doesn't matter as much as what happened to me, and more importantly, what I did about it. This is the story of how I almost married a monster, how he tried to break me in front of everyone I loved, and how I fought back not just for myself, but for every woman who came before me and everyone who might have come after. I still remember the weight of that white dress, the way the fabric felt both like armor and a prison. I remember the sound of the organ music starting, the collective intake of breath from 200 guests, and the smile on his face. That smile I had once thought was charming, but had learned to recognize as something far more sinister. But I'm getting ahead of myself. To understand why I did what I did at that altar, you need to understand how I got there in the first place, and that's a journey that started 2 years before. On a rainy Tuesday afternoon in October, when I quite literally bumped into the man who would become both my greatest nightmare and my most powerful teacher about who I really am. I was 26 years old, working as a marketing coordinator for a mid-sized tech company, living in a studio apartment that I could barely afford, and honestly just trying to figure out my life like everyone else in their 20s. I wasn't looking for love. I was focused on my career, on building something meaningful, on proving to myself and everyone else that I was capable and independent. My parents had divorced when I was 12, a messy, painful split that had taught me to be cautious about relationships, to guard my heart, to never depend too completely on another person. So when I met him, I had walls up, strong walls that I thought were impenetrable. I was wrong. He crashed through those walls like they were made of paper, and at the time, I thought that was romantic. I thought it meant we were meant to be. I didn't realize that someone who doesn't respect your boundaries from the beginning will only get worse as time goes on. That October day, I was rushing out of a coffee shop, juggling my laptop bag, my phone, and a hot latte, not paying attention to where I was going because I was already late for a meeting. I collided with someone coming through the door, and my coffee went everywhere. All over my white blouse, all over his expensive-looking suit, creating a moment of chaos that somehow felt like the universe had orchestrated it. He laughed. Not a mocking laugh, but a genuine, warm, disarming laugh that immediately put me at ease, even as I was mortified and apologizing profusely. He insisted it was his fault, insisted on buying me another coffee, insisted on paying for my dry cleaning. His name was Marcus, he told me, and he worked in finance at a firm downtown. He had these intense green eyes that seemed to see right through you, and a confidence that was magnetic. Within 5 minutes of talking to him, I felt like I'd known him for years. He had this way of making you feel like you were the only person in the world, like everything you said was fascinating and important and worth his complete attention. I gave him my number before I even realized what I was doing. Looking back now, with everything I know, I can see that even that first meeting was calculated. The way he positioned himself to create that collision, the way he had the perfect responses ready, the way he mirrored my body language and speech patterns to create instant rapport. But in the moment, all I felt was swept off my feet. He texted me that same evening, just a simple message saying he couldn't stop thinking about our conversation and asking if I'd like to have dinner with him that weekend. I said yes. That dinner turned into a 5-hour conversation where we talked about everything. Our childhoods, our dreams, our fears, our philosophies on life. He was charming and vulnerable in equal measure, sharing stories about his difficult upbringing with an alcoholic father, his struggles to put himself through college, his determination to build a successful life. He asked questions about my family, my work, my passions, and seemed genuinely interested in every answer. By the end of that night, I was completely captivated. The next 3 months were like something out of a romantic movie. Marcus pursued me with an intensity that I mistook for devotion. He sent flowers to my office. He showed up with my favorite takeout when I was working late. He remembered every little detail I mentioned and would surprise me with thoughtful gestures based on those details. He integrated himself into my life seamlessly, meeting my friends, charming my mother when I finally introduced them, making himself indispensable to my daily happiness. And I fell for it. I fell for him. Hard. I thought I had found my person, my partner, my future. I thought the universe had literally pushed us together in that coffee shop because we were meant to be. Every red flag that appeared, I painted green with the brush of love and hope and the desperate desire to believe I had finally found something real. The relationship moved fast, but it didn't feel too fast at the time. It felt exciting, passionate, meant to be. Within 6 months, we were practically living together. though we each kept our apartments for appearance's sake. Marcus had a beautiful condo downtown with floor-to-ceiling windows and expensive furniture that felt more like a showroom than a home. But I overlooked that too, telling myself he just had sophisticated taste. He started making comments about my apartment, how small it was, how unsafe the neighborhood seemed, how he worried about me being there alone. At first, I thought he was being protective and caring. I didn't recognize it as the beginning of isolation. He suggested I should spend more nights at his place where he could take care of me and make sure I was safe. It felt loving. It felt like being cherished. It felt like everything I'd ever wanted from a relationship. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, things began to shift. It started with small things that I rationalized away. He didn't like one of my best friends, Jenna, saying he got weird vibes from her and that he thought she was a bad influence on me. When I defended her, he didn't push. He just looked hurt, said he was only trying to look out for me, that he could see things I couldn't see because I was too close to the situation. He dropped it, but the seed was planted. The next time Jenna invited me out, I found myself hesitating, questioning her motives, wondering if Marcus was right. That's how it works, you see. He didn't forbid me from seeing my friends. That would have been too obvious. Instead, he made me doubt them, made me question my own judgment, made me choose to pull away on my own. With Jenna, he waited until she made a mistake, a small one. She forgot to call me back one day when she said she would, and he pounced on it saying, "See, I told you she doesn't really care about you. Real friends don't forget about you like that." It was absurd, but I was already conditioned to trust his perspective more than my own. Other friends fell away gradually as Marcus consumed more and more of my time and attention. He always had plans for us, always had somewhere he wanted to take me, something he wanted to show me. If I made plans with friends, he wouldn't explicitly object, but he'd look disappointed, say something like, "I was really hoping we could spend that time together, but if your friends are more important, I understand." The guilt was crushing. I started saying no to invitations, started prioritizing Marcus above everything else, started building my entire life around him. My coworkers noticed I wasn't coming to happy hours anymore. My mother commented that she didn't see me as much. My friends stopped reaching out as frequently when I kept canceling plans. And through it all, Marcus was there, supportive and attentive, telling me that all I really needed was him anyway, that other people just complicated things, that the deepest kind of love was when two people were enough for each other. I believed him. God, I believed every word. The control extended to other areas gradually. He started commenting on what I wore, nothing aggressive at first, just observations like, "That skirt is pretty short, isn't it? I just don't want other guys getting the wrong idea about my girlfriend." Or, "I love that you're comfortable enough to not wear makeup around me, but you're going to wear that to dinner? I just want you to look your best." Each comment chipped away at my confidence, made me second-guess my choices, made me increasingly dependent on his approval. I started asking his opinion before I got dressed. I started changing clothes if he seemed less than enthusiastic about an outfit. I started seeing myself through his eyes instead of my own, and his eyes were critical and demanding in ways I didn't fully recognize. He also became involved in my career, which I initially appreciated because I thought he was helping me. He'd review my presentations, give me feedback on my work projects, offered to introduce me to people in his network who might help my career. But his feedback became more critical over time, pointing out flaws and mistakes, suggesting I wasn't working hard enough or smart enough, implying that without his help, I'd never advance. When I got passed over for a promotion at work, he consoled me by saying, "It's okay, baby. Not everyone is meant to climb the corporate ladder. Maybe you're just not cut out for that level of responsibility. There's no shame in that." The words were dressed up as comfort, but they landed like blows to my self-esteem. I started doubting my professional abilities, started wondering if I was as capable as I'd always thought I was, started shrinking in meetings and second-guessing my contributions. My performance at work actually began to suffer, not because I was less competent, but because my confidence was eroding under his constant subtle criticisms, disguised as concern and support. After about 8 months together, Marcus started talking about marriage, not in a distant someday kind of way, but in an immediate, this is definitely happening way. He'd make comments like, "When we're married," or "in our house together," or "our kids are going to be so beautiful." Part of me thrilled at these references. Wasn't this what I wanted? A committed relationship with someone who saw a future with me? But another part of me, a quieter part that I kept suppressing, felt rushed and pressured. We'd only been together for 8 months. I barely knew who I was in this relationship anymore, let alone whether I wanted to legally bind myself to him forever. But whenever I suggested we slow down, he'd get this look on his face, hurt, withdrawn, cold, that made me panic. He'd say things like, "I thought you loved me. I thought you wanted the same things I want. Maybe I misread this whole relationship." The fear of losing him, of losing what I thought we had, was stronger than my hesitation. So I reassured him, told him I did want those things, pushed my doubts down deeper where they couldn't interfere with his plans for our future. The proposal came at the 10-month mark. He took me to an expensive restaurant, the kind with cloth napkins and a sommelier, and dishes that were more art than food. I should have been excited, but I felt nauseous the entire evening, though I told myself it was just nerves and anticipation. Halfway through the meal, he got down on one knee, pulled out a ring that must have cost several months of his salary, and asked me to marry him in front of a dining room full of strangers who immediately started applauding. Everyone was watching. The pressure was immense. Every woman at every table was looking at me with envy and anticipation. How could I say anything but yes? So I said yes. I said yes with tears streaming down my face, though I couldn't have told you if they were tears of joy or tears of something else entirely, something I didn't want to name. Marcus slipped that ring on my finger, and I felt the weight of it like a shackle. But I smiled. I smiled and kissed him, and accepted the congratulations from strangers, and posted the obligatory ring photo on social media, and called my mother to tell her the news. Everyone was so happy for me. Everyone said how lucky I was, what a catch Marcus was, how perfect we were together. And I tried to believe them. I tried to be as happy as everyone expected me to be. But that night, after we got back to his condo and he fell asleep beside me, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, feeling like I'd just signed a contract I hadn't fully read, committed to terms and conditions that I didn't completely understand. The engagement period was supposed to be happy, but it became the most anxious time of my life. Marcus immediately took control of the wedding planning, insisting he wanted to be involved in every decision because this is our day, baby, not just yours. But his involvement meant that nothing I wanted actually happened. I wanted a small, intimate ceremony with close family and friends. He wanted a large, impressive wedding that would make a statement. I wanted a simple outdoor venue. He insisted on a formal ballroom at an exclusive hotel. I wanted to wear my grandmother's vintage lace dress that my mother had preserved for me. He said it was outdated and shabby and that his bride needed to wear something that reflected his status. Every disagreement followed the same pattern. I'd express my preference, he'd dismiss it, I'd try to advocate for what I wanted, he'd get angry or cold or hurt, and I'd eventually capitulate to avoid conflict and restore peace. I told myself I was being flexible, that compromise was part of relationships, that the specific details of the wedding didn't matter as much as the marriage itself. But deep down, I was losing pieces of myself with every surrender, watching the wedding and my life become shaped entirely by someone else's vision and desires. The guest list became a particular point of contention. Marcus wanted to invite business associates and distant relatives I'd never met. When I questioned the necessity of inviting people neither of us was close to, he exploded in anger for the first time in our relationship. He shouted that I was embarrassing him, that I didn't understand how important appearances were in his industry, that my small-minded thinking was going to hold him back professionally. I was shocked and frightened by his rage. He'd never raised his voice to me before. Afterward, he apologized profusely, said he was under stress at work, that he didn't mean it, that he'd never speak to me that way again. He bought me flowers and jewelry and was extra attentive for days afterward. I forgave him. I convinced myself it was an isolated incident, that everyone has moments of stress, that I should be more understanding of the pressure he was under. But it wasn't isolated. It became a pattern. He'd blow up over something small, terrify me with his anger, then apologize and love-bomb me back into compliance. Each time I forgave him a little faster, excused his behavior a little more readily, accepted the responsibility for his outbursts a little more completely. My mother noticed something was wrong about 3 months before the wedding. She came over to help me address invitations, and she found me crying in the bathroom, overwhelmed and exhausted and deeply unhappy, though I couldn't articulate why. She held me and asked if I was sure about this marriage, if Marcus was really the right person for me, if I was marrying him because I wanted to, or because I felt I had to at this point. I was defensive, protective of Marcus and our relationship, insisting that everything was fine, that I was just stressed from wedding planning and work and trying to balance everything. But she looked at me with these worried eyes and said something I'll never forget. "Sweetheart, I've been where you are. I know what it's like to ignore your gut because you've already told everyone you're getting married, and sent out invitations and committed to a path. But I'm telling you right now, it's easier to cancel a wedding than to escape a bad marriage. If something doesn't feel right, listen to that feeling. It's trying to protect you. I thanked her for her concern and assured her I was fine, but her words haunted me. They echoed in my head during sleepless nights when Marcus was beside me breathing peacefully, completely unaware of my turmoil. They whispered to me when I caught sight of myself in the mirror and saw a woman I barely recognized, thinner, paler, with dark circles under her eyes and a constant expression of anxiety. They screamed at me when Marcus criticized me in front of the wedding planner for not understanding basic logistics, or when he belittled my opinions about centerpieces, or when he scheduled a tasting menu at a restaurant I'd told him I didn't like, because his preferences were always more important than mine. 2 months before the wedding, something happened that should have been my final warning, my clear exit sign, but I was so deep in the fog of manipulation that I couldn't see it clearly. We were at Marcus's condo going over the seating chart, a tedious task that had already caused several arguments. I suggested seating my college roommate Sarah near my cousin Maya because they'd met before and gotten along well. Marcus disagreed, saying Sarah should be at a back table because she wasn't important enough to be prominently placed. I pushed back, defending Sarah and questioning why he got to unilaterally decide who was and wasn't important at our wedding. His face changed. It's hard to describe how, but it was like watching a mask slip, seeing something cold and cruel underneath the charming exterior I'd fallen for. He grabbed my wrist, hard enough to hurt, hard enough to leave marks that I'd later cover with concealer and long sleeves. He pulled me close and said in a low, threatening voice that I had no idea how lucky I was that someone like him would even marry someone like me, that I was a mediocre woman with no real accomplishments who should be grateful he'd chosen me, that if I embarrassed him or made him look bad in front of his colleagues and family at the wedding, I'd regret it for the rest of my life. Then he shoved me away, and I stumbled backward, catching myself on the edge of the couch. For a long moment, we just stared at each other, and I saw clearly, maybe for the first time, who he really was. Not the charming man who'd swept me off my feet in a coffee shop. Not the attentive boyfriend who'd seemed to cherish me. But someone who viewed me as a possession, a reflection of his status. Someone to control and dominate and break down until I was too small and scared to ever challenge him. I should have left that night. I should have called off the wedding, packed my things, run as far and fast as I could. Instead, Marcus shifted immediately into apology mode, though his apology was different this time. He didn't grovel or buy me gifts. He simply explained, calmly and coldly, that relationships require hierarchy, that someone has to be in charge, that he made more money and had more social capital, and therefore his judgment should prevail in disputes. He said he loved me, but that love didn't mean equality. It meant each person playing their role, and my role was to support him and defer to him and trust his decisions. He said if I couldn't accept that, then maybe we shouldn't get married after all, but he'd already put down deposits and invited people and invested in our future. So calling it off now would be humiliating for both of us and would prove I'd never really loved him in the first place. The gaslighting was masterful. He'd physically hurt me and threatened me, but within an hour, I was apologizing to him, promising to be more supportive, agreeing to the seating chart he wanted, accepting his worldview where my opinions and feelings were secondary to his preferences and image. I told myself that all couples struggle, that relationships take work, that no one is perfect, that if I just tried harder to understand him and meet his needs, things would get better. I was wrong. Things got worse. The final month before the wedding was suffocating. Marcus's control intensified in ways that were increasingly difficult to rationalize. He wanted access to all my accounts, social media, email, banking, everything. He said married couples shouldn't have secrets. That transparency was essential for trust, that if I had nothing to hide, I shouldn't object to sharing passwords. When I hesitated, expressing discomfort with giving up all privacy, he accused me of hiding something, suggested maybe I was talking to other men or planning to leave him or being disloyal in some way. The accusations were absurd, but they worked because they made me feel I had to prove my innocence, prove my loyalty, prove I was trustworthy. So I gave him my passwords. I gave him access to every digital corner of my life, and he went through everything methodically, reading old conversations with friends, checking my browsing history, monitoring my spending. He deleted contacts from my phone that he didn't approve of. He unfriended people on my social media accounts without asking me. He transferred money from my savings account to a joint account he controlled, saying we should consolidate our finances before the wedding. I watched my independence dissolve like sugar in water, sweet at first and then just gone, impossible to separate back out. He also intensified his criticism of my appearance and behavior. Nothing I did was quite right. My hair was too messy or too styled. My clothes were too casual or too dressy. My conversation at dinner parties was too quiet or too opinionated. My laugh was too loud. My jokes weren't funny. I was gaining weight, he said, and needed to be more careful about what I ate before the wedding, because he wanted his bride to look good in photographs. I started skipping meals, started exercising compulsively, started obsessing over every calorie and every perceived flaw in my appearance. I dropped 15 pounds in 3 weeks, and people complimented me on how great I looked, not realizing I was starving myself to meet impossible standards set by someone who claimed to love me. My friends, the few who were still around, tried to reach out, tried to express concern, tried to get through to me. Sarah sent me a long text message 2 weeks before the wedding, saying she was worried about me, that I seemed different, that Marcus gave her bad feelings, that she'd heard him speak dismissively about me when he thought she wasn't listening. She begged me to reconsider, to take more time, to not rush into a marriage I might regret. I showed Marcus the text, seeking reassurance that Sarah was wrong, that her concerns were unfounded. Instead of reassuring me, he used it as evidence that Sarah was trying to sabotage our relationship, that she was jealous of what we had, that she wanted me to be alone and miserable like she was. He insisted I cut off contact with her completely, said she couldn't come to the wedding, that if I valued our relationship at all, I'd choose him over a friend who was actively trying to destroy our happiness. So I uninvited Sarah. I sent her a cold, formal text saying I didn't appreciate her interference in my relationship and that she wasn't welcome at the wedding. She responded with heartbroken messages that I deleted without fully reading because Marcus was watching over my shoulder, nodding in approval as I severed that final, meaningful connection to my old life, my old self, my old support system. The week before the wedding, I had a full-blown panic attack. I was at the final dress fitting, standing in front of a mirror in this beautiful designer gown that Marcus had chosen, surrounded by the seamstress and Marcus's mother and his sister, all cooing about how stunning I looked, how lucky Marcus was, how perfect the wedding would be. And I couldn't breathe. My chest tightened, my vision blurred, my hands started shaking uncontrollably. I excused myself and locked myself in the bathroom, sliding down the wall until I was sitting on the cold tile floor, gasping for air, feeling like I was drowning on dry land. My body was rejecting this future, screaming at me to run, to escape, to save myself while I still could. But I didn't listen. I splashed cold water on my face, steadied my breathing, went back out and apologized for the disruption, blamed low blood sugar or dehydration or stress. Anything but the truth, which was that every cell in my body knew I was making a catastrophic mistake, but my mind was too clouded by manipulation and fear and sunk costs to act on that knowledge. The night before the wedding, I couldn't sleep at all. According to tradition, Marcus and I were staying in separate hotel rooms, not seeing each other until the ceremony. I should have been excited, giddy with anticipation, dreaming about the life we were about to start together. Instead, I was nauseous and terrified, pacing the hotel room in the dark, looking at that white dress hanging on the closet door and feeling like it was a shroud, like I was preparing for my own funeral rather than my wedding. My mother was staying in the adjoining room, and she must have heard me moving around because she knocked softly on the connecting door around 2 a.m. When I let her in, she just held me without saying anything for a long time. Then she asked me one simple question. Do you want to marry him? Not, are you ready? Or are you excited? But, do you want to marry him? I opened my mouth to say yes automatically, the way I'd been saying yes to everything for months, the way I'd been trained to agree and comply and suppress my own desires and instincts. But the word wouldn't come out. Instead, I started crying, deep sobs that came from somewhere profound and honest, somewhere I'd locked away for so long I'd almost forgotten it existed. And I told her everything. I told her about the control, the isolation, the criticism, the anger, the fear. I told her about the bruise on my wrist that had faded but not disappeared. I told her about giving him my passwords and losing my friends and not recognizing myself anymore. I told her I was terrified of him, but also terrified of the embarrassment of calling off the wedding, of what people would say, of what Marcus might do if I tried to leave him. My mother listened to all of it, and then she said the words that changed my life. You are my daughter, and I love you more than anything in this world. If you walk away right now, I will support you completely. We'll handle the embarrassment, we'll deal with the guests, we'll manage the fallout. None of that matters as much as your safety and happiness. But if you go through with this wedding, you need to know that it will be 1,000 times harder to leave later. He's already shown you who he is. Believe him, and save yourself while you still can. We sat there together in that hotel room as the sky slowly lightened, as the morning of what was supposed to be my wedding day arrived, and I made a decision. I decided to trust myself, to honor the panic and fear that had been trying to warn me, to value my future self more than I feared other people's opinions. I decided not to marry Marcus, but I didn't just want to run away and hide and send a text cancellation. Something in me, something that had been compressed and suppressed for so long, wanted to face him, wanted to confront him, wanted to make sure he understood that I saw through his manipulation, that I rejected his control, that I was reclaiming my life and my voice. I wanted to stop him from doing to someone else what he'd done to me. So my mother and I came up with a plan. I would get ready as if the wedding was proceeding. I would walk down that aisle, but when the officiant asked if I took Marcus to be my husband, I would say no, and I would tell everyone exactly why. It was risky. Marcus's temper was unpredictable, and I didn't know how he'd react to being publicly rejected and exposed. But my mother would be right there, and we'd arranged for hotel security to be present just in case things escalated. I needed to do this not just for myself, but for the other women Marcus had likely manipulated before me, and would certainly target after me if I didn't speak up. So I put on that expensive designer dress. I did my hair and makeup. I carried the elaborate bouquet his mother had insisted on. And I walked down the aisle of that ballroom toward Marcus, toward 200 guests who had no idea what was about to happen, toward the moment that would either destroy me or set me free. The walk down that aisle felt endless and surreal, like moving through water or a dream where your legs won't cooperate and time stretches in impossible ways. Every step in those uncomfortable heels Marcus had chosen was an act of courage and an invitation to panic. I could see him standing at the altar in his expensive tuxedo, that confident smile on his face, that possessive gleam in his eyes as he watched me approach, watched me come to him like a prize he'd won, like property he was about to claim legally and permanently. My bouquet trembled in my hands, white roses and calla lilies that cost more than my monthly rent, flowers I hadn't chosen any more than I'd chosen the dress or the venue or any other aspect of this performance masquerading as a celebration of love. The music swelled around me, that traditional wedding march that usually sounds joyful, but in that moment sounded like a funeral dirge. Guests turned in their seats to watch me pass, smiling, crying happy tears, completely unaware that they were witnesses to something far different than they imagined. I saw Marcus's business partners, the colleagues he'd invited to impress with his perfect life and perfect wife. I saw his family members, his mother who'd always treated me like I wasn't quite good enough for her precious son, his sister who'd participated in the subtle criticisms disguised as helpful suggestions. I saw the few friends I had left, the ones who hadn't been successfully alienated yet, looking at me with expressions that ranged from joy to concern, because even in their happiness for me, some of them sensed something was wrong. And I saw my mother, standing in the front row where she'd be close enough to intervene if necessary, looking at me with fierce love and support and readiness to protect me from whatever came next. That's what gave me strength as I reached the altar, as I took my place across from Marcus, as the officiant began the ceremony with traditional words about love and commitment and partnership that felt like mockery given the reality of our relationship. Marcus reached for my hands, and I let him take them, felt his grip, too tight, always too tight, always a reminder of his need to control and possess. He was still smiling, but up close I could see tension around his eyes, could sense he knew something was off, could feel his fingers squeeze mine in warning, in threat, in demand that I play my part in this charade. The officiant spoke about the sacred bond of marriage, about two people choosing to intertwine their lives in love and respect and mutual support. Marcus's grip tightened with each phrase, his smile becoming more forced, his eyes darting to my face, trying to read what I was thinking, trying to assess whether I was going to comply or rebel. He could sense something was wrong, but he couldn't quite identify what, couldn't quite believe I would actually defy him, especially not here, not now, not in front of everyone. The arrogance of abusers is that they truly believe their victims are too broken, too scared, too invested in avoiding embarrassment to ever stand up for themselves in a moment that matters. The officiant moved through the ceremony, and I could feel the moment approaching, could feel my heart pounding so hard I thought everyone in the room must hear it, could feel adrenaline flooding my system with a clarity and strength I hadn't felt in months. And then the officiant turned to me and asked the question, the traditional question that millions of brides have answered with joy and certainty and hope. Do you take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband? to have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death do you part. The room went completely silent, waiting for my yes, anticipating the happy conclusion to this ceremony, ready to burst into applause and celebration. Marcus was staring at me intensely, his jaw clenched, his hands crushing mine, his eyes communicating a clear threat about what would happen if I didn't say the right words. And I looked right back at him, this man who had spent months breaking me down, isolating me, controlling me, hurting me, shaping me into someone small and scared and obedient. I looked at him and I saw him clearly, maybe for the first time ever, without the filter of manipulation or hope or fear. I saw a predator, an abuser, someone who would make my entire life a prison if I let him. And I said, loud and clear so everyone could hear, "No, I don't." The gasp that went through the room was like a physical force, a collective intake of breath that seemed to suck the oxygen from the space. For a fraction of a second, nobody moved, nobody spoke. Everyone just stared in shock, trying to process what had just happened, trying to understand if they'd heard correctly, if this was some kind of joke or performance art or fever dream. Marcus's face transformed in an instant from confident groom to something terrifying, something I'd only glimpsed in private moments but never seen fully unleashed. His charming mask didn't just slip, it shattered completely. His eyes went dark with rage, his face flushed red, the veins in his neck became visible as his fury took over. He lunged toward me and I stepped back instinctively, but I didn't run. I stood my ground because running was what he expected, what he'd conditioned me to do every time he got angry, every time he threatened, every time he made me feel small and powerless. But I wasn't powerless anymore. I found my voice, the voice I'd suppressed and silenced and apologized for over and over again. And I spoke, not just to Marcus, but to everyone in that room, to every witness who needed to understand what they'd almost celebrated, what they'd almost participated in by attending this wedding. "I can't marry you, Marcus," I said, my voice shaking but audible, gaining strength with each word, "because I've spent the last year watching you systematically destroy who I am. You isolated me from my friends and family. You criticized everything about me until I didn't recognize myself anymore. You controlled my money, my appearance, my decisions, my entire life. You physically hurt me and then convinced me it was my fault. You made me believe I was lucky that someone like you would want someone like me, when the truth is that you targeted me because you saw someone you could manipulate and control and break." Marcus tried to interrupt, tried to grab my arm, but my mother was suddenly there, positioning herself between us, and hotel security that we'd quietly arranged was moving closer, ready to intervene if necessary. Marcus's face contorted with rage and something else. Fear, maybe, that his carefully constructed image was crumbling in front of everyone who mattered to him. "That's insane," he spat out, his voice venomous. "You're unstable. You're crazy. Everyone, she's having some kind of breakdown. This is what I've been dealing with. Her emotional instability, her need for constant attention and drama." It was exactly what I expected him to say. The predictable response of someone being held accountable. The classic abuser's defense of attacking the victim's credibility and sanity. But I was prepared. I turned to address the crowd directly, making eye contact with his colleagues, his family, the people whose opinions he cared about most. "I'm not crazy, and I'm not having a breakdown. I'm having a moment of clarity, and I need you all to know what kind of man you're supporting, because I won't be his last victim if someone doesn't stop him." I pulled up my sleeve to show the fading bruise on my wrist, visible if you looked closely, evidence that I'd been too ashamed to show anyone before but was ready to display now. This is from 2 months ago when he grabbed me hard enough to leave marks because I disagreed with him about wedding seating arrangements. But the physical abuse isn't even the worst part. The worst part is how he destroyed my sense of self, made me doubt my own judgment, isolated me from everyone who cared about me, controlled every aspect of my life until I was too scared and confused to leave. I'm not marrying him because I choose myself. I choose my safety. I choose my future. And I'm standing here telling you all this because I don't want anyone else to fall for his charm and manipulation the way I did. Marcus was shouting now, calling me horrible names, saying I was a liar and a manipulator, that I'd seduced him and trapped him, and now was trying to destroy his reputation. But his very reaction, the rage, the insults, the inability to control himself, was proving my point more effectively than anything I could say. People in the crowd were looking uncomfortable, whispering to each other, and I could see his mother's face had gone pale, His sister was crying, and several of his colleagues were staring at him with expressions of shock and disgust. Some people were taking out their phones, recording this meltdown, this public unmasking of someone they thought they knew. Security finally stepped in when Marcus tried to push past my mother to get to me, his hands reaching for my throat or my face or whatever he could grab in his fury. They restrained him, held him back while he continued to shout obscenities and threats, promising he'd ruin me, destroy my reputation, make sure I never worked again, sue me for embarrassment and breach of contract and anything else his lawyers could think of. His true nature was on full display now for everyone to see, not the charming businessman or devoted fiancé, but the controlling, violent abuser who couldn't tolerate losing power over someone he'd worked so hard to dominate. My mother wrapped her arms around me, and I collapsed into her embrace, shaking with adrenaline and relief and terror about what I'd just done, but also feeling lighter than I'd felt in a year, like I'd just removed chains I'd been carrying for so long. I'd forgotten what freedom felt like. The crowd was in chaos. Some people were leaving hastily, uncomfortable with the scene unfolding, while others remained frozen in their seats, unsure what to do or how to process what they'd witnessed. The officiant had backed away, looking distressed and confused. Marcus's family was gathering around him as security held him back, and I could hear his mother making excuses, saying I must have misunderstood things, that Marcus would never do what I was accusing him of, engaging in the kind of denial that probably explained how Marcus had become the person he was in the first place. But I also saw other reactions that gave me hope. I saw some of the women in the crowd nodding, their faces showing recognition and understanding, perhaps seeing their own experiences reflected in my words. I saw a few of Marcus's colleagues looking at him with new eyes, perhaps remembering moments they'd dismissed or ignored that now made sense in this new context. I saw people approaching my mother and me with words of support, telling me I was brave, that I'd done the right thing, that they were sorry they hadn't seen what was happening earlier. One woman I didn't know came up to me with tears streaming down her face and whispered, "Thank you for speaking up. He did the same thing to my sister 3 years ago, but she was too afraid to tell anyone. Seeing you stand up to him gives me hope that she might find her voice too." That moment, that one stranger's gratitude, made every uncomfortable second worth it. Because this wasn't just about me anymore. This was about breaking the silence that allows abuse to continue, about refusing to protect someone's reputation at the expense of others' safety, about speaking truth even when it's terrifying and awkward and socially unacceptable. My mother guided me out of the ballroom, security creating a barrier between us and Marcus, who was still shouting threats and accusations as his family tried to calm him down. We went straight to the hotel room I'd been getting ready in just hours before, and I finally took off that expensive white dress, that costume that had never really been mine, and put on jeans and a t-shirt and felt like myself for the first time in forever. My mother called the police to report the threats Marcus had made and to document the assault from 2 months earlier, even though we both knew it would be difficult to prosecute. But creating an official record was important, not just for my protection, but for the protection of whoever Marcus targeted next. Over the next few hours, as news of the canceled wedding spread through social media and text messages and phone calls, something unexpected happened. Other women reached out, women who had dated Marcus before me, women who'd had similar experiences but had never told anyone because they were ashamed or afraid or didn't think they'd be believed. Have you ever experienced something traumatic and then discovered you weren't alone, that others had survived similar situations? The validation and connection that comes from shared experience is powerful beyond words. The aftermath of that wedding, became a strange mix of chaos and healing, public spectacle and private reckoning. The story spread quickly, in our social circles, on social media, even picking up some local news attention because the details were dramatic and the setting was unusual. I became briefly infamous, though opinions were divided. Some people praised my courage, called me brave and strong and an inspiration for speaking up. Others criticized me harshly, saying I'd humiliated Marcus unnecessarily, that if I had concerns, I should have addressed them privately instead of causing a public scene, that calling off the wedding was fine, but exposing him was vindictive and cruel. The criticism stung, but it also revealed something important: how much our society values men's reputations over women's safety, how we're expected to protect abusers from consequences by suffering in silence, how speaking truth is reframed as vindictiveness when that truth is uncomfortable or damages someone's carefully cultivated image. But the women who reached out to me, the ones who shared their own experiences with Marcus or with men like him, kept me grounded in the knowledge that I'd done the right thing. Within a week, 5 different women had contacted me, each with a story disturbingly similar to mine. Marcus had a pattern, a clear methodology he used on every relationship. He'd find women who were successful but had some vulnerability. Maybe childhood trauma, maybe recent heartbreak, maybe low self-esteem hidden under professional competence. He'd love bomb them intensely, sweep them off their feet, make them feel special and chosen and adored. Then, once they were invested, once they'd introduced him to their friends and families and identities, he'd start the slow process of breaking them down. He'd isolate them from support systems, criticize them subtly at first and then more overtly, control their finances and appearance and decisions, alternate between rage and remorse to keep them off balance and eager to please him. One woman, Rebecca, told me she'd been engaged to him 4 years ago and had called off the wedding just 2 weeks before the ceremony. But she'd done it quietly, privately, telling people they'd mutually decided it wasn't working out, protecting his reputation because she was so conditioned to prioritize his needs over her truth. She said seeing me speak up publicly had finally given her permission to tell people what had really happened to her, to stop carrying the shame that belonged to him. Another woman, Diane, had dated him for 6 months before escaping, and she said he'd stolen money from her, maxed out credit cards in her name, and then threatened to ruin her professionally if she reported him. She'd been so frightened of his threats that she'd just absorbed the financial loss and tried to move on, spending years rebuilding her credit and her sense of safety. Hearing these stories was simultaneously validating and heartbreaking. Validating because it confirmed my experience wasn't unique or exaggerated, that Marcus was indeed a serial abuser with a calculated pattern. Heartbreaking because of how many lives he'd damaged, how much pain he'd caused, how the system had failed to stop him because each of his victims had suffered in isolation, not knowing about the others, not realizing they were part of a pattern. We decided to do something about it. The 6 of us, me and the 5 other women who'd come forward, met together, shared our stories in detail, and compiled evidence. We had emails, texts, photos of bruises, medical records from therapy sessions, financial documents showing his theft and control. We took everything to a lawyer who specialized in abuse cases, and while she warned us that criminal prosecution would be difficult given the nature of the evidence and the passage of time, she helped us explore other options. We also reached out to a local domestic violence organization that worked with survivors, and they connected us with a journalist who was writing a series about patterns of abuse in romantic relationships. We told our stories, all of us, creating a comprehensive picture of Marcus's methodology and impact. The article was published 3 months after my non-wedding, and it was detailed and devastating, showing clearly how one person had systematically abused multiple women over several years, and how each abuse had been enabled by silence and shame and social conditioning that taught us to protect our abusers rather than ourselves. The publication of that article brought more consequences than I'd imagined possible. Marcus's employer, the prestigious financial firm downtown, launched an internal investigation after several female colleagues came forward with complaints about his behavior toward them in professional settings, behavior they'd previously dismissed or tolerated but now recognized as part of a larger pattern. He was suspended and eventually terminated, losing the high-status position that had been so central to his identity and power. His reputation in our city was destroyed beyond repair. Social groups uninvited him from events. His networking contacts dried up. Dating apps banned his accounts after women reported him. It wasn't legal justice in the traditional sense. He never faced criminal charges because the standard of proof is so high, and most of what he'd done fell into gray areas legally, even if it was clearly abusive morally and psychologically. But it was a form of justice nonetheless, the kind that comes from community accountability and collective truth-telling. For me personally, the months following the wedding were a journey back to myself. I moved into a new apartment that Marcus didn't know the location of, changed my phone number, blocked him on every possible platform. I started therapy with a counselor who specialized in trauma and abusive relationships, and slowly began unpacking everything that had happened, processing the manipulation, understanding how I'd been targeted and conditioned, forgiving myself for not leaving sooner. That self-forgiveness was perhaps the hardest part. I kept asking myself how I'd been so stupid, so blind, so weak. How had I let someone control me so completely? How had I lost myself so thoroughly? Why hadn't I listened to the red flags, the warnings from friends, my own instincts? My therapist helped me understand that abuse is a process, not an event. It doesn't happen all at once. It happens gradually, incrementally, with each small concession and each normalized violation building on the last, until you're so far from who you used to be that you don't recognize yourself anymore. She helped me see that I wasn't weak or stupid. I was human, responding to calculated manipulation from someone skilled at identifying and exploiting vulnerabilities. She helped me reclaim my story, to see myself not as a victim who'd been broken, but as a survivor who'd found the strength to save herself. I also worked on rebuilding the relationships I'd lost or damaged during my time with Marcus. I reached out to friends I'd pushed away, apologized for disappearing, explained what had been happening even though it was humiliating to admit how completely I'd been controlled. Some friendships were damaged beyond repair, people who felt too hurt by my absence or who didn't understand abuse dynamics and judged me for staying as long as I did. But many friends welcomed me back with open arms, relieved to have me back, grateful I'd escaped, supportive of my healing journey. Jenna, the friend I'd uninvited from my wedding at Marcus's insistence, was particularly gracious. She came over with wine and takeout the week after the canceled wedding, and instead of saying, "I told you so," or making me feel worse about not listening to her warnings, she just hugged me and said, "I'm so glad you're okay. I'm so glad you got out. That's all that matters now." Reconnecting with her, rebuilding that trust, remembering what healthy friendship felt like. It was medicine for my soul. My relationship with my mother also deepened in beautiful ways. She'd always been there for me, but standing by me that morning when I decided not to go through with the wedding, supporting me through the chaos and aftermath, helping me rebuild my life, it created a bond between us that was stronger than before. She never once made me feel stupid for getting involved with Marcus in the first place. She never said I warned you, even though she had tried to voice concerns. She just loved me through it, showed up consistently, reminded me of who I was before Marcus and who I could be again. She was my anchor when I felt like I was drowning in shame and fear and uncertainty about the future. Professionally, I had to rebuild as well. My performance at work had deteriorated so much during my relationship with Marcus that I'd been on the verge of being fired. After the canceled wedding, I had an honest conversation with my boss, explained some of what had been happening in my personal life without going into extensive detail, and asked for another chance. She was surprisingly understanding, sharing that she'd also survived an abusive relationship in her 20s and recognized the signs she'd been seeing in me. She gave me a performance improvement plan with clear expectations, and I threw myself into work with renewed focus and energy, now that I wasn't spending all my mental resources managing an abuser and his demands. Within 6 months, I'd not only met the improvement plan requirements but exceeded them. I got the promotion I'd been passed over for the previous year. I rebuilt my professional reputation and confidence. I remembered that I was actually good at my job, competent and creative and valuable, and that Marcus's constant criticism had been about controlling me, not about my actual abilities or worth. About a year after the wedding, I was invited to speak at a domestic violence awareness event. I was terrified. Public speaking has always been frightening for me, and talking about something so personal and painful in front of hundreds of strangers seemed impossible. But I thought about that woman at my wedding who'd thanked me for speaking up, who'd said her sister had survived similar abuse and needed to see someone fighting back. I thought about how my silence might allow Marcus to target someone new who didn't know his history. I thought about all the women still trapped in situations like mine who might hear my story and recognize their own experience and find courage to leave. So I spoke. I told my story in front of a room full of survivors, advocates, law enforcement, social workers, and community members. I talked about the gradual nature of abuse, how it doesn't start with violence, but with charm and intensity and boundary violations disguised as devotion. I talked about isolation and control, and the way abusers break down your sense of reality until you can't trust your own judgment. I talked about the shame that keeps victims silent and the courage it takes to speak up, knowing you'll be judged and criticized and disbelieved by people who don't understand. I talked about standing at that altar and choosing myself, choosing my safety, choosing my future, even though it meant embarrassment and social consequences and temporary chaos. And I talked about life after escape, about the slow process of healing, about rediscovering yourself, about building authentic relationships based on respect rather than control. When I finished speaking, the applause was overwhelming. But what mattered more were the women who approached me afterward with tears in their eyes, sharing their stories, thanking me for making them feel less alone, asking for resources or advice, or just wanting human connection with someone who understood. Several women told me that hearing my story had given them the courage to leave relationships they'd been trapped in, to file restraining orders, to believe they deserved better than what they'd been accepting. One woman said, "I've been with my boyfriend for 3 years, and you just described my exact life. I didn't realize it was abuse because he's never hit me. But everything else you said, the isolation, the criticism, the control, the way he makes me doubt myself, that's my relationship. I'm going to leave. Thank you for showing me it's possible. That conversation, and dozens like it over the following months as I continued speaking at events and supporting other survivors, convinced me that speaking up had been the right choice. Yes, it was uncomfortable. Yes, I faced criticism and judgment. Yes, Marcus made attempts to discredit me and threaten me legally that eventually went nowhere but caused stress. But the alternative, staying silent to avoid discomfort while he went on to abuse others, was unthinkable. I couldn't have lived with myself knowing I had the power to warn people and chose not to use it. Do you know what it's like to transform your trauma into something meaningful, to take the worst experience of your life and use it to help others? It doesn't erase the pain or make the abuse retroactively worthwhile, but it gives the suffering purpose and creates something positive from something that was purely destructive. Now, 2 years after that wedding day when I said no at the altar and changed the trajectory of my life, I'm in a completely different place. I'm still single, and that's a conscious choice. After Marcus, I needed time to heal, to rediscover who I am outside of someone else's expectations and control, to learn what I actually want from life rather than what I'd been conditioned to accept. I've been in therapy consistently, working through not just the trauma from Marcus, but also deeper patterns from my childhood. My parents' divorce, my father's emotional unavailability, my learned tendency to sacrifice my needs to maintain relationships, my fear of abandonment that made me vulnerable to love bombing and manipulation. I've learned about attachment theory and trauma responses and healthy relationship dynamics. I've learned to identify red flags early, to trust my instincts, to establish and maintain boundaries, to understand that someone pushing past my boundaries isn't passionate or devoted. They're disrespectful and potentially dangerous. I've learned that real love doesn't require you to make yourself smaller or sacrifice your identity or tolerate mistreatment. I've learned that I'm enough exactly as I am, that I don't need someone else to complete me or give me value or validate my existence. The most profound shift has been internal, reclaiming my sense of self, my confidence, my autonomy. I make decisions now without second-guessing myself constantly. I trust my judgment. I speak up when something bothers me instead of suppressing it to avoid conflict. I've rebuilt my social life with authentic friendships based on mutual respect and genuine care, rather than the superficial relationships Marcus had allowed or controlled. I've pursued hobbies and interests that are mine alone, not filtered through someone else's approval. I've traveled solo, moved into a beautiful apartment that reflects my taste entirely, gotten a dog that Marcus never would have permitted because he didn't like animals. I've created a life that's fully mine, and it's quieter than the drama of my relationship with Marcus, but infinitely more satisfying and authentic. Professionally, I've thrived. That promotion was just the beginning. I've continued advancing, recently moving into a senior management role that I would never have achieved if I'd married Marcus, and continued shrinking under his criticism and control. I lead a team now, and I try to create an environment where people can be authentic and make mistakes and learn without fear, because I know what it's like to work while trapped in an abusive situation, how it poisons every aspect of your life and performance. I've also become involved with the domestic violence organization that supported me during my recovery, serving on their board and helping develop programs for survivors. We've created a support group specifically for people who experienced abuse in relationships that didn't involve physical violence, because so many survivors of emotional and psychological abuse don't recognize their experiences as valid or serious. We've developed educational programs for young people about healthy versus unhealthy relationship dynamics, teaching them to identify warning signs before they're deeply invested. We've worked with law enforcement and legal professionals to help them better understand coercive control and non-physical abuse so they can respond more effectively when survivors seek help. This work has become a passion and purpose I never anticipated, taking my personal pain and transforming it into systemic change that helps others. As for Marcus, I've kept tabs on him from a distance through mutual acquaintances and public records, not out of lingering attachment, but out of practical safety. He left our city about 6 months after the article was published, unable to rebuild his reputation locally. He moved to a different state and attempted to reinvent himself professionally and personally. For a while, I worried he was out there targeting new victims who didn't know his history. But the internet is forever, and the article about his pattern of abuse follows him. I've heard from several women in his new city who found the article when they Googled him after meeting him, who reached out to thank me for creating that public record that protected them from making the same mistake I almost made. That's the power of speaking up, of creating documentation, of refusing to protect abusers from the natural consequences of their behavior. One of the most beautiful developments has been the community that formed among the women who survived Marcus. The six of us who initially came together to share our stories have become genuine friends, supporting each other through healing and celebrating victories, and simply understanding each other in ways that others who haven't experienced abuse can't fully grasp. We meet monthly for dinner, and those evenings are sometimes heavy with difficult conversations about triggers and setbacks and ongoing impacts of trauma, but they're also full of laughter and hope and pride in how far we've each come. We've reclaimed not just ourselves, but also the power of female solidarity and collective action. Together, we're stronger than any of us could be alone. We've each found different paths forward. Some are in new, healthy relationships. Some are single by choice like me. Some are pursuing education or career changes or relocations. But we all share the knowledge that we survived something designed to destroy us, and we chose ourselves when it mattered most. If you're reading this or watching this or hearing my story and seeing yourself in it, if you recognize the patterns I'm describing in your own relationship, please know that you deserve better. You deserve love that lifts you up rather than breaks you down. You deserve a partner who respects your autonomy and celebrates your strengths rather than exploiting your vulnerabilities and criticizing your weaknesses. You deserve relationships built on equality and genuine care rather than control and manipulation disguised as devotion. Leaving is hard. I won't minimize that. It's terrifying and complicated and emotionally exhausting. You might face social judgment or financial hardship or legal battles or stalking and escalated abuse. But staying is harder in the long run. Staying costs you your sense of self, your mental health, your future, potentially your physical safety, or even your life. And you are worth saving. You are worth the temporary chaos and discomfort of escape. You are worth fighting for. If you're in an abusive situation and you're reading this, start by reaching out to someone safe, a friend, family member, therapist, or domestic violence hotline. The National Domestic Violence Hotline number is 1-800-799-7233, and they have resources, safety planning assistance, and trained advocates who can help you understand your situation and options. Start documenting the abuse. Save texts, emails, record incidents in a journal, photograph bruises, create a paper trail that can help you later. Make copies of important documents and store them somewhere your abuser can't access. If possible, build a support network of people who know what's happening and can help you when you're ready to leave. Create a safety plan for how you'll exit, where you'll go, what you'll need. And trust yourself. If you feel afraid, if you sense danger, if your gut tells you something is wrong, believe those instincts even if you can't articulate exactly why. Your intuition is trying to protect you. Have you been through something similar? Have you survived an abusive relationship or helped someone escape one? I'd love to hear your story in the comments below. Sharing our experiences breaks the isolation that abuse depends on and creates community and hope for others still trapped. And if this video resonated with you, if my story touched something in you or helped you understand abuse dynamics better or gave you courage to make changes in your own life, please leave a like to help this message reach more people who need to hear it. The more we talk openly about abuse, not in abstract terms but in concrete, specific personal terms that help people recognize it in their own lives, the more power we take away from abusers and give back to survivors. Subscribe to I Live to Tell for more stories of survival, resilience, and transformation. This channel exists to amplify the voices of people who've been through terrible things and came out the other side, who refuse to let their worst experiences define them, who turn trauma into testimony and pain into purpose. Hit that notification bell so you never miss a story. You never know which one might be the message someone desperately needs to hear at exactly the right moment. Thank you for listening to my story, for creating space for this difficult conversation, for being part of a community that values truth and healing over comfort and silence. If my story accomplished nothing else, I hope it showed you that it's never too late to choose yourself, to reclaim your voice, to walk away from what's destroying you even if everyone expects you to stay. I stood at that altar and said no when yes was expected, and it was the scariest and best decision of my life. Whatever your altar moment is, whatever decision you're facing where you know deep down what you need to do but you're terrified of the consequences, I hope you find the courage to honor yourself. You deserve a life built on authenticity and safety and joy, not one built on fear and compliance and slow destruction. And you have the power to create that life, one brave decision at a time. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. And please take care of yourself. You're more valuable and more loved than any abuser could ever make you believe.